I never thought I'd end up living in my son's basement at 65. My husband Frank and I had planned everything so carefully, or so I believed. 43 years of marriage, 2 children raised, a modest home in Milwaukee where we'd built our lives, brick by brick. Then Frank's heart attack changed everything. No warning, no goodbye, just the deafening silence he left behind. When the medical bills came due, the life insurance barely covered half. One by one, I watched our carefully laid plans crumble like autumn leaves. My teaching pension wasn't enough. And the house, that beautiful Cape Cod we'd painted blue the summer our son Bradley graduated college, had to be sold. Bradley insisted I move in with them. "Mom, we have plenty of space," he'd said, showing me the finished basement of his suburban Chicago home. His wife Melissa had nodded beside him, a tight smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. I should have paid more attention to that smile. That first year passed in a haze of grief and gratitude. Then the letter arrived, plain, unassuming, addressed to Frank at our old Milwaukee address, and forwarded to Bradley's. Inside was a key, a bank statement, and 3 words that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. Remember your promise. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Martha and Frank Wilson had spent their whole lives being practical people. We weren't rich, but we were responsible. Frank worked for the Milwaukee Public Works Department for 32 years. Water systems maintenance, nothing glamorous, but steady. I taught 3rd grade at Oakwood Elementary, where I spent my days surrounded by construction paper art and the honest questions only 8-year-olds dare to ask. We lived in a blue Cape Cod on Linden Street, 3 bedrooms and an old oak tree, in the front yard that dropped acorns on the roof every fall. Frank would stand out there with a rake, grumbling about the mess while secretly enjoying the rhythm of the task. We'd saved diligently, his pension, my teacher's retirement, our modest 401k. Nothing that would put us on a cruise ship too exotic, ports but enough, we thought, to keep us comfortable through our golden years. "When we retire," Frank would say, sketching plans on napkins at our kitchen table, "we'll fix up the screened porch, maybe travel to the Grand Canyon. Nothing fancy. Just us with a thermos of coffee watching the sunset." Our son Bradley had moved to Chicago after college, climbing the corporate ladder at a marketing firm. He'd married Melissa, a dental hygienist with perfect posture and an even more perfect home. Our daughter Claire had settled in California, too far away for casual Sunday dinners, but faithful with her weekly calls. We were proud of them both. They'd built lives better than our own, which is what every parent hopes for. Frank's heart attack came on a Tuesday morning. He'd gone out to get the mail, and by the time I found him on the driveway, the envelopes scattered around him like fallen leaves, it was too late. The paramedics were kind but clear. There was nothing they could have done even if I'd found him sooner. The funeral was a blur. Faces from the neighborhood, Frank's colleagues, my fellow teachers bringing casseroles and condolences. I nodded and thanked them mechanically, feeling like I was standing outside my body, watching someone else go through the motions. Claire flew in from California for 5 days, organizing paperwork and helping me make lists. Bradley drove up from Chicago 3 times that week, his forehead creased with concern. Melissa arranging flowers and cleaning dishes with efficient precision. Then everyone went home, and I was alone in our blue house with its creaking floors and empty spaces. The medical bills started arriving before I'd even put away Frank's clothes. The heart specialist, the ambulance, the emergency room, all services rendered for a man already gone. Our insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. Frank's life insurance policy, which he'd proudly purchased decades ago, turned out to be woefully inadequate in today's dollars. "It's called living benefit depletion," the insurance agent explained, not unkindly. The policy was set up when dollar values were different, I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by bills with red past due stamps, and realized that our careful planning hadn't been careful enough. My teacher's pension wouldn't cover the mortgage and these medical expenses. The 401k was decent, but would deplete quickly at this rate. The math was unforgiving, no matter how many times I recalculated. "Mom, you can't stay there," Bradley said during one of his visits, watching me struggle through another stack of bills. "The property taxes alone will eat up your savings." "I'm not selling the house," I insisted. "This is our home. Frank and—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Bradley's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Dad would want you to be financially secure, not house rich and cash poor." I knew he was right, but admitting it felt like losing Frank all over again. Over the next month, I met with a financial advisor who confirmed what I already knew. Keeping. The house wasn't sustainable. "Your best option is to sell while the market is strong," she advised. "Invest the equity, find a smaller place, maybe a retirement community." The thought of a retirement community made my stomach turn. I wasn't ready to be surrounded by wheelchairs and scheduled activities, to become someone who needed looking after. That's when Bradley made his offer. "Move in with us," he said over the phone. "We have plenty of space. The basement is finished. It has its own bathroom, a small kitchenette. You'll have privacy, but you won't be alone." "I can't impose on you and Melissa," I protested weakly, even as relief flooded through me. "You raised me, Mom. Let me help now." 2 weeks later, I stood in my empty living room. The furniture had been sold or stored, the walls bare where family. Photos had hung. The blue Cape Cod on Linden Street wasn't mine anymore. I'd signed the papers that morning, handing the keys to a young couple with a toddler and a baby on the way. They'd been so excited, pointing out where they'd put the crib, asking if the oak tree out front was good for climbing. I smiled and nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Bradley helped me pack my car, clothes, photo albums, Frank's watch and wedding ring, my grandmother's teapot. The essentials of a life condensed to what would fit in a Honda Civic. "It's not forever, Mom," he said, closing the trunk. "Just until you figure out your next chapter." The drive to Chicago was 3 hours of staring at the highway, radio off, trying not to think too much about what I was leaving behind or what lay ahead. Bradley. And Melissa's house was in Northbrook, a suburb north of Chicago. It was bigger than our Cape Cod, a 2-story colonial with a manicured lawn and hydrangeas blooming along the front walk. Perfect, like Melissa's smile as she greeted me at the door. "Welcome, Martha," she said, hugging me briefly. "Let me show you your space." The basement was nice, recently renovated with new carpet, a small bathroom, and a sitting area with a TV. A twin bed had been set up in the corner, with fresh linens and a quilt I recognized from Bradley's childhood room. "We thought about putting in a kitchenette," Melissa explained, gesturing to a mini fridge and microwave set up on a small table. "But you're welcome to use the main kitchen any time, of course." "It's perfect," I lied, looking around at the space. That would now be home. There was one small window near the ceiling, letting in a sliver of late afternoon light. "Thank you both for doing this." "Family helps family," Bradley said, squeezing my shoulder. "That's what Dad always said, right?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Frank had said that many times. Family helps family. I just never thought I'd be the one needing the help. That first night, lying in the twin bed in my son's basement, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of pipes and footsteps above me, I finally let myself cry. For Frank. For our blue house. For the retirement we'd planned that would never come to pass. I cried until my throat hurt, and my eyes swelled, muffling the sound with a pillow so Bradley and Melissa wouldn't hear. The next morning, I put on my brave face and began adjusting to my new reality. Bradley left for work early, but Melissa worked part-time at a dental office nearby, so she was often home. She was polite, always polite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an intrusion in her perfectly organized life. "Feel free to use anything in the kitchen," she'd say, while simultaneously rearranging the mug I'd left on the counter to its proper place. "We usually eat dinner around 6, she'd mention, a gentle reminder that their schedule was now mine, as well. I tried to be the perfect house guest, quiet, tidy, grateful. I kept my belongings confined to the basement, did my own laundry when they were both at work, offered to cook but deferred to Melissa's meal plans. I spent hours at the local library to give them space, volunteered at a nearby elementary school, joined a grief support group that met Wednesday afternoons at the community center, and so the months passed. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter. I sent Christmas cards with my new address, called Claire weekly, adapted to the rhythms of Bradley and Melissa's home. I was surviving, not living, but told myself this was temporary, just until I figured out my next chapter, as Bradley had said. I never expected that chapter would begin with a letter addressed to a dead man. It was a Wednesday morning in April when the letter arrived. I'd been living in Bradley and Melissa's basement for just over a year by then, and we'd settled into an uneasy routine. I woke each morning around 6, earlier than my son and his wife, careful to move quietly through their kitchen as I made my tea. The morning light barely reached the basement windows, but I'd learned to appreciate those thin slivers of sunshine. Some days I'd take my mug outside to their back patio, wrapped in one of Frank's old cardigans that still smelled faintly of him, and watch the neighborhood come alive. Bradley would leave for work by 7:30, always stopping at the patio door to check on me. "You okay, Mom?" he'd ask, briefcase in hand, already mentally at his office downtown. "I'm fine, honey," I'd reply with my practiced smile. "Have a good day." Melissa's schedule at the dental office varied. 3 days a week she'd leave shortly after Bradley. On those days, the house was mine until mid-afternoon, and I could breathe easier. I'd venture upstairs, use the main living area, maybe watch something on their big television instead of the small one in the basement. But I was always careful to leave everything exactly as I'd found it, erasing any evidence of my presence before Melissa returned. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The days Melissa worked from home were the hardest. She ran a small, side business selling handcrafted jewelry online, photographing her creations at the dining room table under a special light setup. On those days, I'd make myself scarce, heading to the library or the park regardless of weather. "Don't feel like you need to leave," she'd say, not looking up from arranging a necklace just so. "You're not bothering me." But the tight set of her shoulders told me otherwise. This was her domain, and I was an intruder, a complication in her ordered life. Bradley noticed nothing, or pretended not to. When the three of us were together, usually for dinner, conversation remained polite, focused on safe topics. Bradley's work projects, Melissa's jewelry sales, news about distant relatives, or neighborhood happenings. Never about how long I might stay or what my plans were. Never about Frank, whose name seemed to fade from our vocabulary a little more each month. On the anniversary of Frank's death, I'd sat alone in the basement looking through old photo albums. Neither Bradley nor Melissa had mentioned the date. Perhaps they'd forgotten, or thought it best not to remind me. That night, I'd called Claire in California, desperate to speak with someone who would remember. "Of course I remembered, Mom," she'd said, her voice warm despite the distance. "I lit a candle for Dad this morning." Claire called more often than she visited. Flight costs from San Francisco were her excuse, but I suspected she also wanted to avoid the awkwardness of staying in Bradley and Melissa's guest room, which had been converted into a home office. When she did visit, twice that year, she slept on an air mattress in the basement with me, both of us whispering late into the night like schoolgirls at a sleepover. "Are you really okay here, Mom?" she'd ask during her Christmas visit, voice low so it wouldn't carry up the stairs. "I'm grateful to have somewhere to go," I'd answered. which wasn't really an answer at all. Claire had frowned, seeing through me as she always could. That's not what I asked. I'd sighed, smoothing the quilt over my legs. It's temporary, honey. I'm saving from my pension, looking at senior apartments. This was partially true. I was saving. Living in Bradley's basement meant my expenses were minimal. But the senior apartments I'd researched were still beyond my means if I wanted to live independently for more than a few years. My teacher's pension stretched only so far, and the proceeds from selling our house had mostly gone to medical bills and catching up on debts Frank and I had accumulated in his final years. The truth was, I felt trapped. Too proud to admit I couldn't support myself. Too practical to spend what little savings I had on rent I couldn't sustain long-term, and increasingly aware that my presence was straining my son's marriage. It was Melissa who first suggested I contribute to the household. Nothing major, she'd said one evening when Bradley worked late, cornering me in the kitchen as I washed my dinner plate. Maybe cover some groceries or the internet bill? It would help with our budget and probably make you feel more settled. Her careful phrasing couldn't disguise what she was really saying. I was a financial burden, and my welcome was wearing thin. Of course, I'd replied, hiding the sting of her words. I'd be happy to help. The next day, I'd written a check for $300 and left it on the counter with a note offering to contribute monthly. Bradley had tried to return it that evening. "Mom, this isn't necessary," he'd said, pushing the check toward me across the kitchen island. "We invited you to stay with us." "I want to contribute," I'd insisted. "I'm not a charity case." Melissa, arranging flowers at the sink, had spoken without turning around. "I think it's a wonderful gesture, Bradley. Your mother wants to maintain her dignity." The check was cashed the next day. After that, the dynamic shifted subtly. Melissa became more comfortable making requests, asking me to pick up dry cleaning while she was at work, to water the plants when they took a weekend trip to Michigan, to prepare dinner on Tuesdays when she had late clients. Small things, reasonable things between family members sharing a home, but each request felt like another link in a chain binding me to their basement. Bradley, meanwhile, seemed increasingly torn between his wife and his mother. I'd catch him watching me with concern, starting conversations he never finished, asking questions about my plans without ever directly suggesting I should have some. "Have you thought about joining that senior travel group from the community center?" he'd ask. Or, "Mrs. Peterson from your school is living in that new retirement complex near the lake, isn't she?" Gentle nudges toward a future that didn't include their basement, wrapped in casual conversation. I tried to be the perfect house guest. I kept the basement spotless, did my laundry during off hours, never cooked anything that might leave lingering odors. I volunteered at a local elementary school 2 days a week, joined a book club at the library, took water aerobics classes at the community center, anything to stay out of the house during the day and give them their space. But no matter how busy I kept myself, no matter how small I tried to make my presence, the truth remained. This was not my home. The basement, with its decent but impersonal furnishings, its single window that gave me more of a view of passing ankles than sky, its constant slight dampness that aggravated my arthritis. It was a way station, not a destination. And Melissa, despite her polite smiles and correct words, made it increasingly clear she was counting the days until her home was truly hers again. It came to a head one Saturday morning in early April. I'd come upstairs to find Melissa rearranging kitchen cabinets, my few dishes and mugs set aside on the counter. "Oh, Martha," she said, startled to see me. "I'm just organizing a bit. I never seem to have enough space for my baking supplies." I nodded, watching as she shifted my things to a higher shelf, one I'd need a step stool to reach comfortably. "No problem," I said, though it was. This kitchen had once been my domain during the day, my small pleasure to bake cookies or prepare soup while they were at work. Now I was being literally put on a shelf, out of reach, out of the way. Actually, Melissa continued, not meeting my eyes as she worked. Bradley and I have been talking. We're thinking of starting a family soon. The implications hung in the air between us. A baby would need space. The basement, perhaps, would need to become a playroom, a guest room for visiting grandparents. Her parents, not me. That's wonderful news, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. You'll be wonderful parents. She finally looked at me then, her expression a mixture of determination and what might have been guilt. We haven't decided anything yet, but I wanted you to know we're thinking about next steps. I'd nodded, turned, and gone back downstairs, my tea forgotten. Sitting on the edge of my twin bed, I'd finally faced the truth I'd been avoiding for months. I couldn't stay here much longer. Somehow, I needed to find a way to stand on my own, again. That's when the letter arrived, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't dared to speak aloud. The letter arrived on a Thursday, nestled between a cable bill and a glossy furniture catalog. I was alone in the house, Bradley at work, Melissa at her dental office, when I collected the mail from the box at the end of the driveway. I almost missed it. The envelope was unremarkable, white, business-sized, with a return address from Lakeside Credit Union in Milwaukee. What caught my attention was the name, Frank Wilson, my husband, dead for over a year now. My hands trembled as I set the other mail on the kitchen counter and examined the envelope more closely. It had been forwarded from our old address on site. Linden Street, a yellow sticker with Bradley's information plastered across the bottom corner. The postmark was dated 3 weeks earlier. For a moment, I just stared at it, this ghost letter addressed to a ghost. Mail for Frank had dwindled months ago, the inevitable trickle of organizations slow to process a death notice, magazine subscriptions we'd forgotten to cancel, the occasional alumni newsletter. But this was different. Something from our old bank, sent recently enough that it mattered. I carried the envelope down to the basement, my sanctuary of sorts, and sat on the edge of my bed. A voice in my head, one that sounded remarkably like Frank's, reminded me that opening someone else's mail was a federal offense. I almost smiled, remembering how he'd always been a stickler for such rules. "You're not here to open it yourself," I whispered to the empty room, sliding my thumb under the sealed flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a form letter, along with a small silver key taped to the top corner. Dear Mr. Wilson, this is a courtesy notice that your safe deposit box, 0247 at our Linden Street branch, will be subject to increased rental fees, effective May 1st, 2024. Your current annual payment will expire on this date. To maintain access to your safe deposit box contents, please visit any branch location to renew your rental agreement. For your convenience, we have enclosed a replacement key, as our records indicate you requested one during your last visit on October 12, 2023. If you have any questions about your account or wish to discuss other banking products, please don't hesitate to contact us. Sincerely, Margaret Foster, Branch Manager, Lakeside Credit Union. I read the letter 3 times, my confusion growing with each pass. Frank hadn't visited any bank in October 2023. He'd been dead for 6 months by then. And we'd never had a safe deposit box, at least not one he'd ever mentioned to me. In 43 years of marriage, through tax seasons and mortgage refinancing, and college tuition payments, a safe deposit box had never come up. Yet here was evidence of one, along with a key that apparently belonged to it. Below the letter was a bank statement, showing the annual fee of $75 had been automatically withdrawn from an account I didn't recognize. The statement showed a balance of just over $5,000, not a fortune, but more than enough to startle me. Frank and I had joint accounts for everything. At least, I thought we did. I turned the key over in my palm. It was small, unremarkable except for the number 247 etched into its surface. The same number as the safe deposit box. Nested at the bottom of the envelope was a small handwritten note on what looked like the torn corner of a notepad. 3 words in handwriting I recognized immediately. Remember your promise. Frank's handwriting. My heart seemed to stop, then race forward to make up for lost beats. The note couldn't have been written after his death, which meant he'd prepared it before, arranged for this key to be sent, anticipated that I would find it eventually. Remember your promise. What promise? In over 4 decades together, we'd made hundreds of promises to each other, from the sacred vows at our wedding to mundane agreements about whose turn it was to take out the trash. I sat on the edge of my twin bed for what felt like hours, the key clutched in my hand, the letter spread on the quilt beside me. Outside, the afternoon light shifted, sending different patterns through my narrow basement window. Upstairs, I heard the front door open and close, Melissa returning from work, but I couldn't bring myself to move. A safe deposit box with $5,000. From an account I didn't know existed. A key delivered after his death. A reminder of a promise I couldn't recall making. Who was the man I'd been married to for 43 years? The next morning, I waited until Bradley and Melissa had left for work before I called the Lakeside Credit Union in Milwaukee. The woman who answered confirmed that yes, Frank Wilson was listed as the owner of safe deposit box number 247, and yes, I could access it as his widow if I brought the proper documentation, death certificate, marriage license, my ID. What about the key? I asked. Do I need that as well? It would expedite the process, she explained. Without it, we'd need to drill the lock, which requires additional paperwork and a fee. I thanked her and hung up, suddenly aware of my racing pulse. Milwaukee was a 3-hour drive from Northbrook. I could be there and back in a day, but I'd need an excuse for my absence. Bradley and Melissa kept loose tabs on my whereabouts, not controlling exactly, but they noticed if I deviated from my usual routines. That evening at dinner, I mentioned casually that I was thinking of visiting an old colleague in Milwaukee. The following week, Mrs. Abernathy from Oakwood is having health problems, I explained, pushing peas around my plate. I thought I might drive up, see how she's doing. Bradley looked up from his pot roast, surprise evident on his face. That's a long drive, Mom. Why don't I take you on Saturday? We could make a day of it. No, I said too quickly. I mean, I'd like to go on my own. It's been a while since I've had a proper visit with old friends. Melissa's fork paused halfway, to her mouth. Are you sure that's safe? The drive, I mean. It's been a while since you've gone that far alone. The concern in her voice seemed genuine, but underneath it I detected something else. Wariness, perhaps, at this spontaneous plan that disrupted the predictable pattern of our lives. I'm 65, not 95, I reminded her, forcing a light laugh. I drove that route for 30 years, and my license is still valid last I checked. Bradley looked like he might object further, but something in my expression must have stopped him. All right, Mom, just keep your phone charged and call when you get there and when you're heading back. Of course, I agreed, relief washing through me. It's just a quick visit, nothing exciting. I spent the weekend gathering the documents I'd need, my driver's license, our marriage certificate preserved in its manila envelope, the death certificate I kept in a folder labeled Frank Important Papers. I found myself avoiding the key, which I'd hidden in my jewelry box beneath a pair of earrings Frank had given me for our 40th anniversary. Each time my fingers brushed against it, a mix of anticipation and dread surged through me. What secrets had Frank kept locked away? All these years? Tuesday morning dawned clear and mild. I left earlier than necessary, eager to escape the basement and the weight of questions I couldn't yet answer. Bradley had already left for work, but Melissa was in the kitchen arranging flowers when I came upstairs with my purse and a small overnight bag. Overnight bag? She questioned, eyebrows rising. I thought this was a day trip. Just in case it gets late, I explained, not meeting her eyes. Mrs. Abernathy might want me to stay for dinner, and I'd rather not drive back in the dark if I'm tired. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Smart. Let me know if your plans change. The drive to Milwaukee was both familiar and strange. I'd made this journey countless times over the years, visiting family, taking weekend trips, commuting to teaching conferences. But never alone, never with such purpose, never with such uncertainty awaiting me at the end. The city welcomed me, with its familiar skyline, the gleam of Lake Michigan visible between buildings as I navigated downtown streets. Our old neighborhood looked much the same, though the blue Cape Cod now sported a red door instead of the white one Frank had insisted on repainting each spring. I drove past slowly, allowing myself a moment of nostalgia before continuing to the Lakeside Credit Union on the corner of Grand Avenue and 5th Street. It was a modest brick building with large windows and a blue awning, unchanged since the last time I'd been there to close our accounts after Frank's death, or what I'd thought were all our accounts. Inside, the air conditioning was cranked too, high, raising goosebumps on my arms as I waited in line for the next available teller. When I reached the counter, a young woman with a neat ponytail and a name tag that read Jessica greeted me with a practiced smile. "I need to access a safe deposit box," I explained, keeping my voice steady. "It belonged to my husband, who passed away last year." Her smile dimmed appropriately. "I'm sorry for your loss. Do you have the necessary documentation?" I showed her everything: death certificate, marriage license, my ID, the key. She examined each item carefully, then asked me to wait while she consulted with the branch manager. 10 minutes later, I was following Jessica down a narrow hallway to a room at the back of the bank. The walls were lined with metal boxes of various sizes, each with a numbered keyhole. She located supper 247, inserted her master key, then gestured for me to use mine. "I'll give you privacy," she said, backing toward the door. "Take all the time you need. There's a button on the wall if you require assistance." The lock turned smoothly, the door swinging open to reveal a metal box about the size of a shoebox. My hands trembled as I lifted it from its compartment and carried it to a small table in the center of the room. For a moment, I just stared at it, this vessel containing whatever Frank had deemed important enough to keep secret from me. Part of me wanted to close it up, return it to its slot, drive back to Bradley's and pretend I'd never received the letter. I could continue living in blissful ignorance, preserving the memory of the man I thought I knew. But the key felt heavy in my palm, and Frank's note, "Remember your promise," echoed in my mind. With a deep breath, I opened the box. The metal box contained 3 items: a thick manila envelope, a small velvet jewelry pouch, and a handwritten letter sealed in a blue envelope with "My name, Martha," written on the front in Frank's distinctive handwriting. My fingers hovered over the contents, uncertain where to begin. The letter seemed the most personal, the most direct communication from beyond the grave, but something held me back from opening it immediately. Instead, I reached for the manila envelope. Inside were legal documents, property deeds to be precise. Not for our home on Linden Street, which we'd paid off just 5 years before Frank's death, but for a place I'd never seen or heard of, 1420 Pinecrest Road, Harbor Springs, Michigan. The deed listed Frank Wilson as the sole owner of a lakefront cottage purchased in 2004, almost 20 years ago. There was a property tax statement showing all taxes paid through the current year, and a homeowner's insurance policy with premiums automatically drafted from the same unknown account that maintained the safe deposit box. My mind reeled. 20 years. For 20 years, Frank had owned property I knew nothing about, in a town we'd never visited together. The cottage had been purchased when our children were already grown, when we were supposedly saving for the retirement we'd planned together. I set the deeds aside with trembling hands and reached for the velvet pouch. It was heavier than I expected, and when I loosened the drawstring, a man's gold pocket watch slid into my palm. Not just any watch, a beautiful antique piece with intricate engravings on its case. I pressed the small latch and the cover sprang open to reveal a watch face with Roman numerals and delicate filigree hands. On the inside of the cover was an inscription, "To Samuel, all my love, Eliza, 1947 Samuel and Eliza." Names that meant nothing to me. Frank's parents were Robert and Catherine. His grandparents were James and Margaret on his father's side, William and Dorothy on his mother's. In all our years together, I'd never heard him mention Samuel or Eliza. I turned the watch over in my hands, searching for answers it couldn't provide. It was clearly valuable, perhaps not in monetary terms, though I suspected it was worth something, but in sentimental value. It had been important enough for Frank to keep locked away, separate from our shared life. Finally, I reached for the blue envelope. My name stared back at me, challenging me to proceed, to learn whatever truth Frank had kept hidden. With unsteady fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded 3 pages of my husband's familiar handwriting. My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've received the key I arranged to have sent to you. I hope it didn't take too long to find its way to you. I'm sorry for the secrets, Martha. More sorry than I can express in these pages. The cottage in Harbor Springs was my father's dream. Not Robert Wilson, the man you knew as my father, but Samuel Weiss, my biological father. The truth is, Robert Wilson adopted me when I was 7 years old after he married my mother, Eliza. Samuel died when I was just 6, a boating accident on Lake Michigan near Harbor Springs, where his family had summered for generations. My mother rarely spoke of him after she remarried. It was too painful, I think, and Robert was a good man who wanted me to be his son in every way. I became Franklin Wilson instead of Franklin Weiss, and as the years passed, the memories of my first father faded. When my mother died in 2003, she left me a small inheritance, money from Samuel's family that Robert never touched. She also left me the pocket watch that belonged to Samuel and a folder of old photographs I'd never seen. Pictures of a cottage on Lake Michigan, of Samuel holding me as a baby, of my mother young and laughing on a wooden dock. I used the inheritance to track down the old Weiss family cottage. It had passed out of the family decades ago, but by some miracle, it was for sale again. I bought it, telling myself I would tell you about it, that we would visit it together, that I would share this piece of my history with you, but something always stopped me. Fear, perhaps, or shame that I'd kept such a significant part of myself hidden for so long, or maybe the selfish desire to have something that was just mine, a connection to the father I barely remembered, but whose blood runs in my veins. I've been visiting the cottage 2 or 3 times a year. Those fishing trips with old work colleagues, those continuing education weekends for the water department. I was at the cottage, sitting on the same dock where Samuel once taught me to fish, sleeping in the same small bedroom where I spent summers as a very young boy. I never brought anyone else there. It was my private pilgrimage, my secret communion with a past I'd almost forgotten. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone, that these brief escapes didn't detract from our life together. But secrets have weight, Martha. They press down on the soul. As I've gotten older, the burden has grown heavier. I've wanted to tell you so many times, especially after my heart scare last year. The doctor's warnings about my cholesterol, my blood pressure. I knew time might be running short. I meant to tell you in person. I truly did. But if you're reading this, I've run out of time. The cottage is yours now. I've arranged everything with my lawyer, Thomas Reynolds. His card is in the manila envelope. The deed will transfer to you upon your presentation of my death certificate. The account at Lakeside Credit Union is also yours, about $5,000, enough to maintain the cottage for a few years if you choose to keep it, or sell it if that's what you prefer. I would understand. Remember your promise, Martha. On our wedding day, you promised to accept all of me, even the parts you didn't yet know. I'm holding you to that promise now, asking you to forgive this deception, to understand that it came not from a lack of love for you, but from a complicated tangle of love for a father I lost too soon, and a life I barely remembered. If I could have one wish, it would be that you visit the cottage at least once. See the sunrise over Lake Michigan from the east-facing porch. Sit on the dock where 3 generations of my family have fished. Open the windows and let the pine-scented breeze remind you that even secrets, once revealed, can bring their own kind of peace. I have loved you completely, Martha, even with this piece of my heart set aside. You have been the great joy of my life, the constant star I navigated by, the home I always return to. All my love, always. Frank P.S. The key to the cottage is taped to the back of this letter. I don't know how long I sat in that small room at the bank, reading and rereading Frank's words until they blurred before my eyes. A bank employee knocked once, gently, asking if I needed anything. I sent her away, unable to form words through the tightness in my throat. Frank Wilson, my husband of 43 years, the father of my children, the man whose socks I'd paired and whose favorite meals I'd cooked, and whose body I'd known as, well as my own, had carried this secret life inside him all our years together. A different name, a different history, a place he escaped to without me. I should have felt betrayed. Perhaps I did, in some corner of my heart. But mostly, I felt a profound sadness. Not for myself, but for Frank. For the little boy who lost his father too young. For the man who felt he couldn't share this essential piece of himself with the woman who loved him. And beneath the sadness, a flicker of something else. Curiosity. A pull toward this unknown place that had meant so much to my husband. Harbor Springs, Michigan. A lakefront cottage. A dock where a man named Samuel Weiss had once taught his son to fish before disappearing from his life forever. I carefully returned the documents and the pocket watch to the safe deposit box, keeping only Frank's letter and the small brass key. That was, as promised, taped to the back of the final page. The bank would hold the rest securely until I decided what to do next. Outside, the afternoon had turned cloudy, with the threat of rain hanging in the air. I sat in my car in the bank. Parking lot. GPS open on my phone, calculating the distance from Milwaukee to Harbor Springs, Michigan. 5 hours and 23 minutes according to the glowing blue line on my screen. Too far to go today. I'd need to return to Bradley's house, regroup, plan. I'd told Melissa I might stay overnight with Mrs. Abernathy, but the thought of fabricating an entire evening's conversation with my former colleague, who was in fact perfectly healthy and living with her daughter in Florida, made my stomach turn. No more secrets, I decided. Frank had kept enough for both of us. I started the car and pointed it back toward Northbrook, my mind racing faster than the traffic around me. By the time I pulled into Bradley's driveway, I had made my decision. It was time to reclaim my independence, to step out of the basement and into whatever future awaited me. A future that now included a cottage on Lake Michigan and the unexplored. History of the man I thought I knew completely. Bradley's car was already in the garage when I arrived, earlier than usual for a Tuesday. As I climbed the steps from the garage to the kitchen, I could hear voices, Bradley and Melissa, talking in the low, intense tones of an argument quickly silenced when a door opens. "Mom," Bradley said, his expression a mixture of relief and something else, concern, perhaps, or suspicion. "You're back earlier than we expected." Melissa stood at the kitchen island, arms crossed, her posture rigid. "How was Mrs. Abernathy?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. The lie I'd planned died on my lips. "I didn't see Mrs. Abernathy," I said, setting my purse on the counter. "I went to Milwaukee to access your father's safe deposit box." The kitchen fell silent. Bradley and Melissa exchanged glances, a wordless communication that excluded me completely. "Safe deposit box?" Bradley finally asked, his voice carefully measured. "What safe deposit box?" I pulled out one of the bar stools and sat down, suddenly aware of how exhausted I was after the drive and the emotional turmoil of the day. Your father had a safe deposit box at Lakeside Credit Union. I received a letter about it last week, a notice about the annual fee and a replacement key. I don't understand, Bradley said, moving to sit across from me. Dad never mentioned a safe deposit box. What was in it? I met my son's eyes, so like his father's. Or rather, like the father he had believed Frank to be. How much should I tell? Him? Frank's secret wasn't just mine to share now. It affected Bradley, too, reshaping his understanding of his own heritage. Documents, I said, keeping my voice steady. Property deeds, a pocket watch, and a letter your father wrote to me before he died. Melissa uncrossed her arms and leaned against the counter. Property deeds? You mean for the house on Linden Street? Shook my head. No, for a cottage in Harbor Springs, Michigan. A place your father owned for almost 20 years without telling any of us. Bradley's face flushed. That's not possible. Dad wouldn't... He stopped, uncertainty flickering across his features. Why would he keep something like that secret? It's complicated, I said, not ready to share everything. Not here in Melissa's immaculate kitchen with tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The important thing is that the cottage now belongs to me. The deed transfers automatically, with Frank's death certificate. So you own a cottage? Melissa asked, her voice rising slightly. Just like that? After all these months of living in our basement because you couldn't afford your own place? The accusation stung, even though I understood it. From her perspective, it must have seemed like I'd been hiding assets while accepting their charity. I didn't know about it until today, I explained. And I don't know much about the property, its condition, its value. I need to go see it. Bradley ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Frank that my heart clenched. When? As soon as possible. Tomorrow, maybe. Tomorrow? Melissa echoed, eyebrows shooting up. Just like that? You're going to drive to Michigan by yourself? It's my property, I said, a note of firmness entering my voice that surprised even me. And I'm perfectly capable of driving to Michigan. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Melissa. Bradley glanced between his wife and me, clearly torn. Let me come with you, he offered. I'll take a couple days off work. We can go together, see what this place is all about. Part of me wanted to accept, to have my son with me when I confronted this new piece of Frank's past, to share the burden of whatever we might find. But something held me back. This journey felt intensely personal, a private reckoning between me and the husband who had kept such a significant secret. That's thoughtful, Bradley. But I need to do this alone, I said, gently. This is something between your father and me. But Mom, I'll be fine, I assured him, reaching across the counter to squeeze his hand. I'll keep my phone charged and check in regularly, but this is something I need to do by myself. Melissa pushed away from the counter, her movements sharp with frustration. I don't think that's wise, Martha. You're not as young as you used to be, and you've never even been to this place before. What if something happens? What if the cottage is in disrepair? What if I'm an adult who can make my own decisions? I interrupted, my patience finally fraying. I appreciate your concern, Melissa, truly. But I've spent the past year living in your basement, walking on eggshells, trying not to be a burden. I've given up my home, my independence, and most of my dignity. Please don't ask me to give up this too. Silence fell over the kitchen again, heavier this time. Bradley looked stunned. I rarely spoke so directly, especially to Melissa. His wife's face had gone rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't realize you felt that way, she said finally, her voice cool. That living with us has been such a hardship. I sighed, regretting my sharp tone but not the sentiment behind it. It hasn't been a hardship. You've both been generous, but it hasn't been easy either, for any of us. You need your space back, your privacy. I need to stand on my own again. Maybe this cottage is the way forward for all of us. Bradley seemed to deflate slightly, the tension leaving his shoulders. Is that what you want, Mom? To move out? The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. For the first time in over a year, I allowed myself to consider what I truly wanted, not just what seemed practical or what would inconvenience others the least. I want to see the cottage, I said finally. I want to understand why it was so important to your father. After that, yes, I think I want to find my own place again, whether it's there or somewhere else. Bradley nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. Okay, but at least let me help you prepare for the trip. We can map out your route, make sure you have emergency contacts along the way, and let us know where you're staying, Melissa added, her tone softening slightly. Just so we don't worry. I agreed to their conditions, grateful for the tentative truce. We spent the next hour looking up Harbor Springs on Bradley's laptop, researching the area, finding the exact location of 1420 Pinecrest Road on satellite images, a small structure barely visible through pine trees, but clearly situated on the shoreline of Lake Michigan. It looks isolated, Melissa commented, peering at the screen. Are you sure there will be cell service out there? If not, I'll find a landline, I assured her. Or carrier pigeons, or smoke signals. The weak joke broke some of the tension, and Bradley actually smiled. Just be careful, he said, and call us when you get there. I want to know what this mystery cottage of Dad's looks like. I agreed, and as the evening progressed, we settled into an uneasy normalcy. Bradley ordered pizza for dinner. Neither Melissa nor I felt like cooking, and we ate in the living room, the TV providing background noise and a buffer against difficult conversations. When I retreated to the basement that night, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Anticipation about seeing the cottage, lingering shock over Frank's revelations, anxiety about the journey ahead, and beneath it all, a quiet certainty that I was about to turn a page in my life, stepping into a chapter I never could have anticipated. I packed methodically, taking only what I thought I might need for a few days. Clothes, toiletries, my medications, a notebook, and my reading glasses. I added Frank's letter and the cottage key, tucking them into the zippered pocket of my purse where they'd be safe. Sleep was elusive that night. I kept imagining what the cottage might look like, creating pictures in my mind based on the glimpse we'd seen on satellite images and the few details Frank had provided in his letter. A dock where he'd fished, an east-facing porch for watching, sunrises, windows that opened to pine-scented breezes. Would I find more of Frank there, or less? Would the cottage help me understand the man I'd been married to, or would it only deepen the mystery? And what would I do with it afterward? Keep it as a connection to him, or sell it and use the proceeds to rebuild my independent life? Questions circled like restless birds, keeping me awake until the first gray light of dawn filtered through my basement window. I rose early, showered, and carried my overnight bag upstairs before Bradley and Melissa were awake. I left a note on the kitchen counter, thanking them for their support and promising to call when I reached Harbor Springs. Then I loaded my bag into the car, programmed the GPS, and backed out of their driveway as the neighborhood was just beginning to stir. 5 hours and 23 minutes according to the route I'd mapped out. 5 hours and 23 minutes to a place my husband had visited in secret for 2 decades, to a history he'd kept hidden throughout our marriage, to a part of himself he'd never fully shared with me. As I merged onto the highway heading north, the rising sun at my back, I felt something unexpected. Not anger or betrayal, but a curious lightness. For the first time since Frank's death, since selling our home and moving into Bradley's basement, I was moving towards something rather than away from it. I was making an active choice rather than passively accepting circumstances. Whatever awaited me at the end of this journey, it was mine to face, mine to decide about. The road stretched before me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the stirrings of something I'd almost forgotten, possibility. I drove north as the landscape changed around me, from the suburbs of Chicago to the rolling farmland of northern Illinois, across the Wisconsin border and into Michigan's lower peninsula. The highway eventually gave way to smaller state roads, then to county routes winding through forests increasingly dense with pine and birch. Harbor Springs revealed itself gradually. First a sign welcoming visitors to the historic waterfront, community. Then glimpses of Lake Michigan between buildings as I followed my GPS through the small downtown. Quaint shops and restaurants lined the main street, most closed for the season. It was early May, still too cool for the summer tourists who would no doubt flood the area in another month or two. I continued past the town center, following Pinecrest Road as it curved away from the lake, then back toward it. The houses grew, further apart, the forest thicker, until I almost missed the small wooden sign marking 1420, half hidden by pine branches. I turned onto a narrow gravel driveway, tires crunching over stone and fallen needles. The drive curved through trees for about 100 yards before opening to a small clearing, and there it was, Frank's secret. My inheritance. A weathered cedar cottage with green trim, a wide porch facing the water, and a wooden dock extending into the blue expanse of Lake Michigan. I sat in my car for several moments, taking in the cottage that had been Frank's secret retreat for 20 years. It wasn't grand or luxurious, just a simple single-story structure with weathered cedar siding and a slightly sagging porch. 2 Adirondack chairs faced the water, their green paint faded by sun and winters. A stone chimney rose from one end of the roof, and wildflowers grew in scattered patches around the clearing. It looked like it belonged here, nestled among the pines with Lake Michigan stretching beyond it. Not an intrusion on the landscape, but a natural extension of it. With a deep breath, I gathered my purse and stepped out of the car. The air smelled of pine and water, with an underlying earthiness from the forest floor. A breeze rustled the treetops, and somewhere nearby, birds called to one another in melodic bursts. The only other sounds the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. The brass key felt weighty in my hand as I approached the front door. It slid into the lock easily, as if it had been recently used and maintained. The door swung open with a slight creak, revealing the cottage interior. I stepped inside, not sure what to expect. A musty, abandoned space? A sterile, barely used retreat? Instead, I found myself in a cozy living room that looked genuinely lived in. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a stack of split logs, neatly arranged beside it. 2 comfortable-looking armchairs and a small sofa faced the fireplace, with a hand-woven rug covering most of the wooden floor. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with what appeared to be a mix of novels, nature, guides, and photo albums. But what caught my attention immediately were the photographs. Framed pictures covered nearly every surface: the mantelpiece, a small writing desk by the window, the end tables flanking the sofa. I moved closer to examine them, my heart racing. These weren't recent photos. They were old, black and white or faded color images from decades ago. A handsome young man in a 1940s swimming costume laughing on a dock, the same man holding a dark-haired toddler, a beautiful woman in a sundress, her hair styled in the fashion of the immediate post-war years, holding the same child on her hip. Samuel and Eliza Weiss, and their son Franklin. I moved from photo to photo, witnessing a history I'd never known existed. Frank as a very young boy, fishing off the dock I could see through the window. Frank builds a sandcastle, his mother watching from a beach blanket. Samuel teaches Frank to paddle a canoe, both of them grinning at the camera. A family history that had ended abruptly, replaced by the one I knew, Frank with his adoptive father, Robert Wilson. But here, in this cottage, Samuel Weiss had remained alive in a way, preserved in these images that Frank had collected and displayed. Beyond the living room was a small, functional kitchen with a round oak table and 4 chairs. A hallway led to two bedrooms, a master with a queen-sized bed covered in a patchwork quilt, and a smaller room that must have been Frank's childhood bedroom, still furnished with a twin bed and a pine dresser. Everything was clean, well-maintained. No dust covered the surfaces, no musty smell permeated the rooms. Someone had been caring for this place regularly. Back in the living room, I noticed a business card propped against a lamp on the desk. Pine Harbor Property Management, seasonal. Home care and maintenance. That explained it. Frank had hired someone to look after the cottage, to keep it ready for his visits. I sank into one of the armchairs, overwhelmed by the reality of this place. This wasn't just a property Frank had purchased on a whim or as an investment. This was a meticulously preserved shrine to his first father, to his original identity, to the childhood that had been interrupted by tragedy. My gaze fell on the photo, albums lining the bookshelf. Rising from the chair, I selected one bound in blue fabric and carried it back to my seat. The first page held a formal portrait, Samuel and Eliza's wedding photo from 1946, according to the handwritten caption beneath. He is in a dark suit, she in a modest white dress with a short veil, both looking impossibly young and hopeful. Page after page documented their early marriage, the birth of their son in 1948, summers at this very cottage. The photos stopped abruptly in 1954, the year Samuel died. The final image showed him standing on the dock with 6-year-old Frank, both holding fishing rods, the sunset turning Lake Michigan to gold behind them. I closed the album, my eyes stinging with tears, not for myself, but for the little boy who had lost his father, and for the man who had felt compelled to keep this essential part of himself separate from the life we shared. The remaining daylight was fading. I should call Bradley, let him know I'd arrived safely. But first, I needed to see the dock, the place where Samuel had taught his son to fish, where Frank had returned year after year to commune with memories of his first father. I stepped out, onto the porch, and followed a flagstone path to the wooden dock that extended about 20 feet into the water. It looked recently repaired, the boards solid beneath my feet as I walked to the end and stood gazing out over Lake Michigan. The sun was beginning its descent, not yet touching the horizon, but casting long golden light across the water. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of Beaver Island, a loon called somewhere to my right, its mournful cry echoing over the water. I could understand why Frank had been drawn back here, why he'd purchased this place when the opportunity arose. There was peace here, a sense of continuity and timelessness. The same water that had lapped against this shore when Samuel taught his son to fish still flowed. The same pines still whispered in the breeze. The same sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Standing there, I felt closer to Frank than I had at any time since his death. Not the Frank Wilson I'd married, but the complete man he'd been, with all his complexities and contradictions. The boy who had lost his father too young. The man who had built a life with me while keeping this essential piece of himself separate. For the first time, I began to understand. His secrecy hadn't been a rejection of me or our life together. It had been a way of preserving something precious that he'd feared might be diluted or diminished if shared. The cottage wasn't an escape from our marriage. It was a connection to a time before the grief that had shaped him, a grief he'd buried so deeply that even I, who had known him for more than 4 decades, had never fully glimpsed it. I watched, the sun sink lower until it nearly touched the water far to the west. Only then did I take out my phone to call Bradley, to fulfill my promise to let him know I'd arrived safely. No signal. Of course, Melissa had been right about that at least. The cottage was too isolated for reliable cell service. I'd have to drive back toward town to make the call. But not yet. The sunset was too beautiful to miss, and I felt a strange reluctance to introduce the outside world into this sanctuary just yet, to break the spell of discovery and understanding that had enveloped me since I'd unlocked the door. Back inside, I explored the cottage more thoroughly. In the kitchen cabinets, I found basic supplies: canned goods, pasta, coffee, tea. The refrigerator was empty but running, ready to be stocked. In the bathroom, medicine cabinet were toiletries, a toothbrush still in its packaging, soap, shampoo. Frank had kept this place ready, not just for his visits, but perhaps anticipating that someday I would be here, following the trail he'd left for me. As darkness fell, I lit the lamps in the living room and built a small fire in the fireplace, grateful for the warmth as the temperature dropped with nightfall. The cottage had a furnace. I'd found the thermostat in the hallway, but the fire seemed more appropriate somehow, more connected to the history of this place. I continued exploring the photo albums, piecing together the story of Samuel and Eliza, Weiss of young Franklin and the summers they'd spent here before tragedy altered their course. There were gaps, of course, questions the photographs couldn't answer. But they provided a foundation, a framework for understanding the man Frank had been before I knew him. In the second bedroom, Frank's childhood room, I found a small wooden desk with a single drawer. Inside was a leather-bound journal with Franklin Weiss embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. I hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but Frank had left this place to me and had guided me here through his letter. He had wanted me to know, finally, all of him. I carried the journal back to the fire and curled up in one of the armchairs. The first entry was dated June 15th, 1953, written in a child's careful printing, complete with backwards letters and spelling errors. Daddy taught me to fish today. I caught 3 fish. Mommy cooked them for dinner. They were yummy. The last entry was dated just 3 months before Frank's death. Another sunset from the dock, perhaps one of my last. The doctor didn't say it directly, but I read between the lines. My heart won't hold out much longer. I should tell Martha about this place. After all these years, I owe her that truth. But every time I try, the words stick in my throat. What would she think of me, keeping this separate life? Would she understand that it wasn't about escaping our marriage, but about preserving a connection to my first father that I've never been able to fully explain? I've made arrangements with Reynolds. If anything happens to me, Martha will receive the key. It's cowardly, perhaps, to wait until after I'm gone. But at least she'll know. She'll stand on this dock, watch this sunset, and maybe then she'll understand. Between those 2 entries stretched decades of occasional visits. Frank coming, here alone to fish, to sit on the dock, to connect with memories of his first father. Brief notations about repairs to the cottage, about hiring the property management company, about purchasing neighboring land to ensure the cottage would remain secluded, and woven throughout, reflections on our marriage, on Bradley and Claire, on the life we'd built together. All of it seen through the lens of his complicated relationship with his own past, with the dual fathers who had shaped him. I read until my eyes grew heavy, until the fire burned down to embers. Finally, I closed the journal and carried it with me to the master bedroom. Tomorrow, I would drive into town, call Bradley, maybe visit the local historical society to learn more about the Weiss family. Tomorrow, I would begin deciding what to do with this unexpected inheritance, whether to keep the cottage as a connection to Frank or to sell it and use the proceeds to rebuild my independent life. But tonight, I would sleep beneath the patchwork, quilt in the bed where Frank had slept during his secret pilgrimages, surrounded by the history he'd preserved and the truth he'd finally shared. I woke to sunlight streaming through the east-facing windows, just as Frank had described in his letter. For a moment, I lay still, orienting myself in the unfamiliar bedroom. The events of yesterday came flooding back: the cottage, the photographs, the journal entries that had given me glimpses into a husband I thought I'd known completely. The Zit's bedside clock read 7:18 a.m. I needed to call Bradley and Melissa to reassure them I was safe. Throwing back the patchwork quilt, I rose and went through my morning routine in the small bathroom, then made a quick cup of coffee in the kitchen. The cottage felt different in the morning light, less like a shrine to the past and more like a living space, peaceful and welcoming. I carried my coffee to the porch and sat in one of the Adirondack chairs, watching the sunlight glitter on Lake Michigan's surface. A pair of ducks paddled near the shore, and somewhere in the trees behind the cottage, a woodpecker drummed rhythmically. After finishing my coffee, I drove back toward town in search of cell service. The bars on my phone appeared about a mile from the cottage, and I pulled onto the shoulder to make my call. Bradley answered on the second ring, his voice tight with worry. "Mom? Where have you been? We expected to hear from you last night. I'm sorry," I said, genuinely contrite. "There's no cell service at the cottage. I should have driven into town last night to call, but I got caught up in exploring." "So you found it? What's it like?" I described the cottage to him. The cedar, siding, the stone fireplace, the dock extending into the lake, keeping my tone neutral, informational. I wasn't ready to share the emotional impact of what I'd discovered, the complicated feelings stirred by Frank's journals and photographs. "It sounds nice," Bradley said, some of the tension leaving his voice. "Is it livable? I mean, has it been maintained?" "Yes, your father hired a property management company to look after it. Everything is in good condition." "And what are you going to do with it?" The question hung between us, the same one I'd been asking myself since I'd arrived. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "I need to spend a few days here, I think. Get to know the place. Learn more about why it was so important to your father." Bradley was quiet for a moment. "There's something you're not telling me," he finally said. "Something about Dad and this cottage." My son had always been perceptive, even as a child, noticing the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the conversations that stopped when he entered a room. I sighed, not wanting to share Frank's secret over the phone but knowing Bradley deserved some explanation. "Your father had a connection to this place from his childhood," I said carefully. "It's complicated and I'm still piecing it together myself. When I get back, we'll talk about it properly, I promise." He seemed to accept this, though reluctantly. "All right, but you'll call every day, just so we know you're okay?" "I will, I promised. And I'll only stay a few days. I need to get groceries and check out the local area today, then decide what's next." After ending the call with Bradley, I continued into Harbor Springs. The town was charming in daylight. Historic buildings, lining the main street, the harbor dotted with boats being readied for the summer season. I found a small grocery store and stocked up on essentials, then spotted a coffee shop with a free Wi-Fi sign in the window. Inside, I ordered a latte and settled at a corner table with my phone. A quick search for Samuel Weiss Harbor Springs yielded several results. Most notably, a mention in the local historical society's online archives about prominent Jewish families who had summered in the area during the pre-war and immediate post-war periods. The Weiss family, it seemed, had been well known in Harbor Springs, operating a successful clothing manufacturing business in Chicago. They had built their summer cottage in 1922, one of several Jewish families who established a small community along that stretch of lakeshore. I jotted down the address of the Harbor Springs Historical Society, intending to visit later. But first, I wanted to speak with the property management company that had been maintaining the cottage. Their office was just 2 blocks away, according to the business card I'd found. Pine Harbor Property Management occupied a small storefront with a green awning. A bell jingled as I entered, and a woman in her 60s glanced up from a computer at the front desk. "Good morning," she greeted me. "How can I help you?" "I'm Martha Wilson," I said. "My husband, Frank Wilson, owned a cottage on Pinecrest Road. I believe your company has been maintaining it?" Recognition flickered across her face. "Mrs. Wilson, yes. I'm Sandra Keene, the owner. I was so sorry to hear about Frank's passing. He was a lovely man." "Thank you," I said, surprised by her personal knowledge of my husband. "I've only just learned about the cottage myself. I'm trying to understand, well, everything about it. Sandra motioned to a chair beside her desk. Please sit down. Frank mentioned you might come someday. He told you about me? I asked, sinking into the chair. Oh, yes, she nodded. He spoke of you often during his visits. He'd stop by here to pick up the keys, chat for a while. He always said you were the anchor of his life, the one constant he could count on. A lump formed in my throat. But he never told me about this place. Sandra's expression softened with understanding. I gathered that. He mentioned it was complicated, that the cottage represented a part of his past he'd kept separate. I never pried, but I could tell it weighed on him, especially in recent years. How long did you know him? I asked. Almost 20 years. He bought the cottage from the Levinson family in 2004. It had passed out of the Weiss family decades earlier, after she paused, uncertain. After Samuel Weiss died, I finished for her. Frank's biological father. She nodded. So you know about that part? I'm learning. Frank left me a letter explaining some of it, and I found photographs and journals at the cottage. But there's still so much I don't understand. Sandra leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. You should talk to Ruth Abrams at the Historical Society. She knew the Weiss family personally. She's in her 90s now, but sharp as a tack. Frank spent hours talking with her whenever he visited. Another piece of the puzzle. Another person who had known this side of my husband that I hadn't. Instead of jealousy, I felt a strange gratitude that Frank had found connections here. People who understood the part of himself he'd kept hidden from me. I'll do that, I said. And I wanted to ask about the cottage maintenance. The arrangement Frank had with you. I'd like to continue it, at least for now. Of course, Sandra said, pulling a file from a drawer. We check the property weekly during the off-season, prepare it for Frank's visits, and handle any necessary repairs. He prepaid for the year, so you're covered through December. She provided me with copies of the maintenance records, a list of local service providers Frank had used, and her personal cell number. Call any time, she said, as I prepared to leave. And Mrs. Wilson? Frank loved that cottage, but he loved you more. He told me once that his only regret was not finding a way to share this part of his life with you sooner. I thanked her, too moved to say more, and headed back to my car. My next stop was the Harbor Springs Historical Society, housed in an elegant Victorian building a few blocks from the waterfront. The woman at the reception desk directed me to a research room at the back of the building, where an elderly woman sat cataloging photographs. She looked up as I entered, adjusting her glasses. Can I help you? I'm looking for Ruth Abrams, I said. Sandra Keene at Pine Harbor Property Management suggested I speak with her. The woman's face brightened. I'm Ruth. And you are? Martha Wilson. My husband was Frank Wilson, though I recently learned he was born Franklin Weiss. Ruth's eyes widened, and she set aside her work, gesturing to a chair beside her table. Martha, of course. Frank mentioned you might come someday. Please, sit down. For the second time that day, I was confronted with the reality that my husband had discussed me with strangers in this town, had anticipated that I might eventually follow the trail he'd left. You knew my husband? I asked, settling into the chair. I knew little Franklin Weiss first, she said, her voice warm with memory. I was friends with his mother, Eliza. Our families had cottages near each other on the lake. I watched Franklin grow from a baby to a bright little boy, always, following his father around like a shadow. She reached for a large photo album on her shelf, opening it to a page marked with a sticky note. Here, this was taken at the Harbor Springs 4th of July picnic in 1953. The photograph showed a group of families gathered on a beach, American flags fluttering from a pavilion in the background. Ruth pointed to a young couple with a small boy between them, Samuel and Eliza, with 5-year-old Franklin holding their hands. They were so happy that summer, Ruth said softly. No one could have imagined that by the next 4th of July, Samuel would be gone and Eliza would be a widow with a young son to raise alone. What happened? I asked. Frank. In his letter, he just said it was a boating accident. Ruth nodded. Samuel took the sailboat out one August afternoon in 1954. A sudden storm came up. Not unusual on the lake, but this one was violent. They found the capsized boat the next morning, but Samuel's body wasn't recovered for 3 days. I closed my eyes briefly, imagining the devastation of that loss. For Eliza, for young Franklin. Eliza was never the same, Ruth continued. She couldn't bear to return to the cottage after that. She sold it to the Levinson family that winter and moved back to Chicago permanently. A few years later, we heard she had remarried, a man named Wilson. I lost touch with her after that, until Franklin appeared here in 2004, looking for information about the Weiss family cottage. Frank found you? Yes. He came to the Historical Society asking about records of the Weiss family. I recognized him immediately. He looked so much like his father. From then on, whenever he visited Harbor Springs, he'd stop by to chat. I shared my memories of his parents, of the summers they spent here. He was piecing together a history he barely remembered. For the next hour, Ruth shared stories of the Weiss family, of the Jewish summer community that had once thrived along this stretch of lakeshore, of the young couple who had brought their son to Harbor Springs each summer until tragedy struck. As I listened, Franklin Weiss, who became Frank Wilson, my husband, came into clearer focus. Not just the man I'd married, but the boy he'd been before, shaped by loss and reinvention in ways I'd never fully understood. Thank you, I said when Ruth finally paused, her voice growing tired. This means more to me than I can express. He wanted you to know, she said, patting my hand. In these last few years especially, he talked about telling you, bringing you here. I think he was working up his courage. But he ran out of time, I said softly. Ruth nodded. The heart doesn't always follow the mind's timeline, but he found a way to bring you here anyway, didn't he? As I drove back to the cottage that afternoon, Ruth's words echoed in my thoughts. Frank had found a way to share this part of himself with me, even if he couldn't do it in life. The cottage, the photographs, the journal, they were his legacy, his final gift to me. Not just property, but understanding. That evening, I sat on the dock as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long golden rays across Lake Michigan. The day's discoveries had left me emotionally drained yet strangely peaceful. With each conversation, each new piece of information, Frank's secret life became less of a betrayal and more of a complicated human story, one of loss, identity, and the parts of ourselves we struggle to reconcile. I'd stopped at a local market on the way back to the cottage, purchasing ingredients for a simple dinner. Now, with a glass of wine beside me and a light sweater protecting against the evening chill, I watched the same sunset Frank had watched, dozens of times from this very spot. Had he thought of me during those solitary evenings? Sandra and Ruth both said he'd spoken of me often, that he'd regretted not finding a way to share this place with me. I wanted to believe them, to accept that his secrecy hadn't stemmed from a desire to exclude me from this part of his life, but from something more complex, fear perhaps, or the difficulty of explaining a connection he barely understood himself. The cottage behind me no longer felt like an alien place, a symbol of deception. It was becoming something else, a gift, an inheritance more valuable than just property. Frank had preserved this connection to his first father, and now he'd passed it to me, trusting that I would understand what he couldn't bring himself to explain in life. As darkness fell, I returned to the cottage and built another fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth pushed back against the evening chill, creating a cozy circle of light in the living room. I curled up in one of the armchairs with Frank's journal, turning to entries I hadn't yet read. June 18, 2005. spent the morning fishing off the dock. No luck. But that was never really the point. I keep expecting to feel his presence here more strongly, but memory is elusive. I was only 6 when he died. What I remember most isn't his face or voice, but the feeling of his hand on my shoulder as he showed me how to cast a line. The security of that touch. The confidence it gave me. July 4, 2008. Watched the fireworks over the harbor tonight. Ruth told me how my parents would take me to the town picnic every Independence Day, how my father would lift me onto his shoulders to see the display. I have no memory of it, but sitting on the beach tonight, I felt a connection to them, to the life we had here before everything changed. September 2nd, 2012. Martha called while I was sitting on the dock this evening. Strange to hear her voice here, these two worlds briefly overlapping. I almost told her then, where I was, why I came here. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but I heard Bradley in the background, asking when I'd be home, and the moment passed. How do you explain a lifetime of separation after so many years? How do you admit to the person you love most that you've kept something so fundamental from them? That last entry caught my breath. I remembered that call. Labor Day weekend, 2012. Bradley and Claire had both been visiting. We were planning a barbecue, and I'd called Frank to remind him to pick up charcoal on his way home from his fishing trip. I'd had no idea he was sitting on this dock, wrestling with whether to tell me the truth. I continued reading, finding similar moments throughout the years, times when Frank had almost revealed his secret, only to retreat back into the pattern of separation he'd established. His entries grew more reflective as he aged, especially after his first heart scare in 2022, May 15, 2023. The doctor didn't say it directly, but the message was clear. My heart is failing. Time is becoming precious. I should tell Martha about this place, about Samuel, about the name I was born with. After all these years of compartmentalizing my life, I owe her that truth. But each time I try, I remember Robert, how good he was to me, how he never treated me as anything less than his son. Would sharing this somehow dishonor his memory? Or is that just an excuse for my cowardice? The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death. October 3rd, 2023. Made arrangements with Reynolds today. If anything happens to me, Martha will receive the key to the safe deposit box, which contains the deed to the cottage and my letter explaining everything. It feels like a failure, arranging for her to learn the truth only after I'm gone. But perhaps it's better this way. She can discover this place, this history, without my anxious hovering, without having to manage my emotions alongside her own. The cottage will speak for itself. The photographs, the journals, they'll tell her what I never found the courage to say aloud. That I've always been two people. Frank Wilson, the man she married, and Franklin Weiss, the boy who lost his father too young. And that I've loved her completely, with both halves of my divided self. I closed the journal, tears blurring my vision. Frank's words confirmed what I'd been coming to understand throughout this journey, that his secret hadn't been about deception, but about protection. Protection of a fragile connection to his first father, protection of an identity he'd never fully integrated, and perhaps even protection of me from the complexity of his divided self. The next morning, I woke early again, drawn by the sunrise filtering through the east-facing windows. After coffee on the porch, I spent the day exploring the cottage more thoroughly, examining every photograph, opening every drawer, learning the history of this place that had meant so much to my husband. In a cedar chest at the foot of the master bed, I found more treasures, a small collection of Samuel's belongings that must have passed to Frank after Eliza's death. A fountain pen with the initials SW engraved on the clip, a leather wallet, worn at the edges, a silver tie clip shaped like a sailboat, small items, insignificant to anyone else, but precious connectors to the father Frank had lost so young, Azzy. The day progressed. I found myself thinking not just about Frank's past, but about my future. What would I do with this cottage now? Sell it and use the proceeds to establish my independence again? Or keep it as a connection to the complete man? I was only now coming to understand. I drove into town again to call Bradley, fulfilling my promise to check in daily. This time we spoke longer. I shared more about what I'd discovered, about Frank's biological father, about the history of the cottage, about the connection to Harbor Springs that had drawn Frank back year after year. "Why didn't he ever tell us?" Bradley asked, confusion and hurt evident in his voice. "Why keep his real father a secret?" "I don't think it was about secrecy exactly," I said, choosing my words carefully. "From what I've learned, he was very young when his mother remarried. Robert Wilson adopted him, gave him his name. Frank became who he was expected to be. By the time he was an adult, that first identity, Franklin Weiss, had become almost like a dream, something distant and half-remembered. But he bought the cottage. He came back here regularly. That wasn't distant or half-remembered. No, I agreed. I think finding this place again allowed him to reconnect with that part of himself. But by then, the pattern of separation was established. The longer he kept it to himself, the harder it became to share. Bradley was quiet for a moment. "So, what are you going to do with the cottage?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all day. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "Part of me wants to keep it, to have this connection to your father's full history. But part of me wonders if I'd be clinging to the past when I should be looking toward the future." "You don't have to decide right away," Bradley pointed out. "The cottage isn't going anywhere." He was right, of course. There was no rush to decide. For now, the cottage was a sanctuary, a place to process everything I'd learned, to make peace with the husband I thought I knew, but was only now fully meeting. That afternoon, I walked along the lakeshore, collecting smooth stones and pieces of driftwood. The beach was deserted, the summer tourists still weeks away. This solitude was exactly what I needed. Time to think, to feel, to decide what came next. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and I returned to the cottage as the first raindrops began to fall. I built another fire against the approaching storm, made a simple dinner, and settled in with more of Frank's journals. As the rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, I felt strangely at home in this place that had been Frank's secret sanctuary. The cottage was a refuge, not just for him but now for me, a space between my old life and whatever came next, a place to gather strength for the journey forward. The storm intensified as the evening wore on, wind howling through the pine trees, rain drumming on the roof. I was about to turn in for the night when headlights swept across the living room windows. Someone was coming up the gravel driveway. For a moment, I felt a flutter of unease. Who would be visiting in this remote location? In the middle of a storm? I moved to the window and peered out through the rain-streaked glass. A familiar car pulled up beside mine, and my heart jumped. Even through the downpour, I recognized the figure that emerged, hurrying toward the porch with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Bradley had come to Harbor Springs. I hurried to the door and flung it open just as Bradley reached the porch, rain streaming from his jacket and hair. "Bradley, what are you doing here?" I stepped back to let him in, stunned by his unexpected appearance. He shook the water from his jacket and ran a hand through his soaked hair. "I had to see this place for myself," he said, his eyes already scanning the cottage interior, taking in the photographs, the fireplace, the comfortable simplicity of it all. After our call, yesterday, I couldn't stop thinking about Dad, about what you told me. "You drove 5 hours in a storm?" I asked, taking his wet jacket and hanging it near the fire to dry. He shrugged, setting his duffel bag on the floor. "The storm hit when I was already halfway here. Besides, it felt important, necessary." I understood. Hadn't I felt the same urgency? The same need to see and touch and experience this place that had been so significant to Frank? "Does Melissa know you're here?" I asked, moving to the kitchen to put on the kettle for tea. A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, or guilt, crossed his face. "We had an argument after we spoke yesterday. She thought I was overreacting, that I should give you space to process everything alone. But this isn't just about you, Mom. This is my history too." I nodded, feeling a surge of empathy for my son. Frank's secret affected more than just me. It reshaped Bradley's understanding of his own identity, his family heritage. "You're right," I said, returning with 2 mugs of tea. "I'm glad you came. There's so much here, so many pieces of the puzzle I'm still putting together." Bradley accepted the tea and moved to the mantelpiece, studying the photographs displayed. "There. Is this him? My biological grandfather?" "Yes, that's Samuel Weiss," I confirmed, standing beside him. "And that's your grandmother Eliza, with your father when he was about 5 years old." Bradley leaned closer, examining the image of the handsome young man with his arm around a beautiful dark-haired woman, a small boy perched on his shoulders. "I have his eyes," he said softly, almost to himself. "Everyone always said I had Dad's eyes, but really I have Samuel's." The observation hit me with unexpected force. He was right. Bradley had inherited those same deep-set, thoughtful eyes that Frank had gotten from his biological father. A genetic legacy that had passed from Samuel to Frank to Bradley, bridging the decades and the separation that Frank had maintained between his 2 identities. "Your father kept journals," I said, gesturing to the leather-bound book on the side table. "He wrote about this place, about Samuel, about why he kept it separate from our life together. If you want to read them," Bradley nodded, his expression solemn. "I'd like that. But first, can you show me around? I want to see everything." Despite the late hour and the storm raging outside, I gave Bradley a tour of the cottage, the small but functional kitchen, the 2 bedrooms, the collection of photographs and mementos that Frank had gathered over the years. I showed him the pocket watch from the safe deposit box, explaining the inscription from Eliza to Samuel. "So my last name should have been Weiss," Bradley mused, turning the watch over in his hands. "Bradley Weiss instead of Bradley Wilson." "Robert Wilson was a good father to Frank," I reminded him gently. "From everything I've learned, he loved your dad as his own, never made him feel like anything less than his true son. The Wilson name is part of your heritage, too." Bradley nodded, but I could see he was still processing, still adjusting to this new layer of family history that had been revealed so suddenly. We ended the tour on the screened porch that faced the lake. The rain had slackened somewhat, though lightning still flickered over the water, and thunder rumbled in the distance. "It's beautiful here," Bradley said, gazing out at the silvery flashes of lightning reflecting on the lake's surface. "Peaceful, even in a storm. I can see why Dad was drawn to it." "It was his connection to Samuel," I explained. "A way of honoring the father he barely remembered, but whose loss shaped him profoundly." Bradley turned to me, his expression troubled. "Why didn't he trust us enough to share this? Why keep it a secret for so long?" It was the same question I'd been wrestling with since discovering the safe deposit box. "I don't think it was about trust, exactly," I said, choosing my words carefully. From his journals, it seems he worried that sharing this place, this history, might somehow diminish it. Or perhaps he feared we wouldn't understand the importance it held for him. "But we're his family," Bradley insisted, a hint of hurt in his voice. "We would have understood." "Would we have?" I asked gently. "If he'd told us 20 years ago that he'd purchased his childhood summer cottage, that he wanted to spend time here connecting with memories of a father he'd lost at 6, would we truly have understood? Or would we have seen it as an oddity, a curious attachment to a past he barely remembered?" Bradley was quiet considering this. "I might have thought it was strange," he finally admitted, but I would have tried to understand. I think he knew that. But sometimes the things that matter most to us are the hardest to explain to others, even those we love. We sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the rain pattering on the porch roof, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Bradley asked the question that had been hovering between us. "What are you going to do with this place, Mom? Are you going to sell it?" I sighed, still uncertain. "I don't know. Part of me wants to keep it, to maintain this connection to your father, but another part wonders if I'm just clinging to the past when I should be moving forward." "You don't have to decide tonight," Bradley pointed out, "but I want you to know. I don't want you living in our basement anymore." The statement hung in the air, blunt and unexpected. I turned to look at him, surprised by the directness. "That came out wrong," he amended quickly. "What I mean is, you deserve your own space, your own life. Whether that's here or somewhere else, I want you to be independent again. Happy." "Your basement hasn't been so bad," I said lightly, trying to ease the tension. "Better than a cardboard box under a bridge." Bradley didn't smile. "It's been hard on all of us. You trying not to intrude, Melissa trying to balance being hospitable with wanting her privacy back, me caught in the middle. Nobody's been happy with the arrangement, Mom. We've just been making do." His honesty was refreshing, if a bit painful, to hear. "I know," I acknowledged. "It was meant to be temporary, but without enough savings to establish myself elsewhere comfortably, I didn't see a way out." "But now you have options," Bradley pointed out. "This cottage. The account Dad left. You said it had about $5,000 in it? That's a start. You could sell the cottage and buy a small condo near us, or keep it and split your time between here and a rental." For the first time, I allowed myself to seriously consider the possibilities. The cottage was probably worth a significant amount. Lakefront property in this area didn't come cheap. Even if I kept it, I could rent it out during the summer tourist season for additional income. "I need to talk to a real estate agent," I said, thinking aloud. "Get an idea of the cottage's value, explore the options." Bradley nodded. "That makes sense. And Mom, whatever you decide, I'll support you. But I think Dad left you this place for a reason. Not just as a financial asset, but as a gift. A piece of himself he wanted you to have." His insight touched me deeply. Frank had indeed left the cottage as more than just property. It was a message, a final revelation of his complete self, entrusted to me to understand and preserve or pass on as I saw fit. We stayed up late into the night, Bradley, reading Frank's journals while I made notes about questions to ask the real estate agent, ideas for moving forward. The storm gradually subsided, leaving behind a gentle patter of rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. When we finally turned in, Bradley taking his father's childhood bedroom, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain and considering the strange turns my life had taken. A year spent in my son's basement, feeling increasingly adrift and dependent. Then a letter addressed to a dead man, a key to a safe deposit box, and the revelation of a secret life my husband had maintained for decades. I'd come to Harbor Springs feeling betrayed and confused. Now, just days later, I felt something entirely different. A growing sense of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing. Frank's secret had been a shock, but it had also been a gift, not just the cottage itself, but the opportunity it represented to reclaim my independence, to start again on my own terms. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized that my feelings about the cottage had shifted. It no longer felt like an alien place, a symbol of my husband's deception. It had become something else, a bridge between past and future, a place of healing and transformation. In the morning, Bradley and I would visit a real estate agent in town, explore my options and begin making concrete plans. But for now, in this quiet moment between day and dream, I allowed myself to simply be grateful. for Frank's final gift, for Bradley's support, and for the unexpected chance to rewrite the story of my retirement years. Morning arrived with surprising clarity after the storm. Bradley and I ate breakfast on the porch, watching sunlight sparkle on the wet leaves and puddles that dotted the clearing around the cottage. Lake Michigan stretched before us, calm and blue, showing no evidence of the previous night's tumult. "I called Melissa this morning," Bradley said, setting down his coffee mug. "Told her where I was, that we'd be heading into town to talk to a real estate agent." He hesitated, then added, "She asked if you'd made any decisions yet." The question hung in the air between us. Had I? In the quiet hours of early morning, watching the sunrise from Frank's, now my east-facing porch, something had settled within me. Not quite a decision, but the beginnings of one. "I'm leaning toward keeping the cottage," I said slowly. "At least for now. There's still so much to learn about this place, about what it meant to your father. Selling it immediately feels premature." Bradley nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think that's wise. There's no rush. But what about your living situation? You can't stay in our basement forever, Mom." "No," I agreed. "I can't, and I don't want to." After breakfast, we drove into Harbor Springs and met with Janet Kozlowski, a real estate agent Sandra Keene had recommended. Her office overlooked the harbor, sailboat masts swaying gently beyond the window as we discussed my options. "The cottage is in a desirable location," Janet explained, consulting comparable property listings on her computer. "Lakefront property on that stretch of Pinecrest Road typically sells for between $350,000 and $450,000, depending on size, condition, and exact proximity to the water." The figures stunned me. I'd known the cottage must be valuable, but hearing the actual estimate made me dizzy. Even at the low end, it represented financial security I hadn't dared hope for after Frank's death and the loss of our Milwaukee home. "That's if you decide to sell," Janet continued. "But there are other options. The summer rental market here is strong. You could easily rent the cottage during peak season, June through August, for around $2,000 per week. 8 weeks of summer. Rentals could generate $16,000, Bradley calculated quickly. "That's significant income." "Exactly," Janet nodded. "Many property owners choose to use their cottages themselves during the off-season, spring and fall, and rent them out during the summer when rates are highest." The possibility crystallized in my mind. Summers elsewhere, perhaps in a small apartment near Bradley and Claire, and spring and fall at the cottage. A life divided between my children and this place that connected me to Frank's hidden past. "What about winter?" I asked. "Is the cottage winterized?" "It is," Janet confirmed. "Your husband made those upgrades about 10 years ago. The property management company can check on it during the winter months if you're not in residence. Ensure the pipes don't freeze, that sort of thing." We left Janet's office with a folder of information, rental management options, market analyses, names of contractors if I decided to make any updates to the property. The concrete details grounded me, turned the emotional whirlwind of the past. Few days into practical considerations, steps I could take toward a new future. Bradley and I spent the afternoon walking through Harbor Springs, exploring the small town that had been so significant in Frank's history. We found the public beach where Ruth had shown me the photograph of the Weiss family at the 4th of July picnic. We wandered through shops along the main street, stopping for lunch at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. "I can picture Dad here," Bradley mused, watching boats bobbing at their moorings. "It suits him somehow, quiet, unhurried, a little old-fashioned." I nodded, seeing it too. Frank walking these streets, visiting with Ruth at the Historical Society, stopping by Sandra's office to pick up the cottage keys. A different version of my husband than the one I'd known in Milwaukee, yet somehow authentic, genuine. Your father contained multitudes, I said softly. I thought I knew him completely, but there were depths I never reached. Does that bother you? Bradley asked, studying my face. That he kept this separate? I considered the question carefully. It did at first, but now, I think I understand better. This place, this connection to Samuel, it was something precious to him, something fragile. He was protecting it, preserving it in amber, keeping it pure. By not sharing it with us? By not risking our misunderstanding, I clarified. Not everyone would appreciate what this cottage represented to him. This link to a father he barely remembered, to an identity he'd set aside but never completely abandoned. It wasn't about excluding us from his life. It was about honoring a connection he feared might be diminished if exposed to outside perspectives. Bradley was quiet for a moment, processing this. I think I get it, he said finally. It's like how some writers can't discuss their work in progress. They're afraid explaining it will somehow drain the magic from it, make it ordinary. Exactly, I said, grateful for his understanding. Your father wasn't being deceitful. He was preserving something sacred to him in the only way he knew how. That evening, back at the cottage, we built a fire and talked about practical next steps. Bradley would return to Chicago the following day. He couldn't take more time off work. I would stay at the cottage for another week, meeting with the property management company to discuss summer rentals, arranging for a proper inspection, and beginning to plan for a future that now included this unexpected inheritance. What about your things in our basement? Bradley asked. Should I pack them up? Have they shipped here? It was a practical question, but it represented so much more. My final departure from their home, my commitment to independence again. Just the essentials for now, I decided. Clothes, some personal items. The rest can wait until I figure out more permanent arrangements. And where will you live when you're not here? Bradley pressed. If you rent the cottage in summer, where will you go? It was the one piece of the puzzle I hadn't quite worked out. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. I could look for a small apartment in Northbrook to be near you and eventually near Claire when she visits. Or maybe I'll explore other options. I've always liked Madison. It's a good halfway point between Milwaukee and Chicago. Whatever you decide, I'll help, Bradley promised. And Mom, I want you to know that having you in our basement this past year, it wasn't a burden. I'm glad we could be there for you after Dad died. I just think it's time for all of us to move forward now. I reached over and squeezed his hand, touched by his sincerity. I know, honey. And I'm grateful for the shelter you provided when I needed it most. But you're right. It's time for me to stand on my own again. The next morning, I stood on the porch watching Bradley's car disappear down the gravel driveway. He'd be back in Chicago by early afternoon, returning to Melissa and their life together. I'd promised to call daily, to keep him updated on my plans, to let him know if I needed anything. Alone again, I turned back to the cottage, my cottage now, with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. There was work to be done, decisions to be made, a future to plan. Frank's secret had initially felt like a betrayal, but it had transformed into an opportunity, a chance to reclaim my independence and build something new from the fragments of the past. I spent the morning clearing space in the master bedroom, making it more my own. I carefully relocated some of Frank's personal items to a cedar chest, preserving them but creating room for myself as well. I rearranged the living room slightly, angling the armchairs to better capture the morning light. Small changes, but significant ones. This wasn't just Frank's sanctuary anymore. It was becoming mine as well, a place where I could honor his memory while forging my own connection to this peaceful spot on Lake Michigan's shore. In the afternoon, I drove into town to meet with Sandra at Pine Harbor Property Management. We discussed summer rental arrangements, scheduled a professional inspection, and set up increased maintenance checks since I would be splitting my time between the cottage and wherever I established my second residence. Frank would be pleased, Sandra said as our meeting concluded. He always hoped you'd find this place eventually, that you'd make it your own. I thought of Frank's journals, of his struggle to find a way to share this part of himself with me. I think he'd be relieved, I said, that the secret's finally out, that the division he maintained for so long has been healed. Will you change? Anything? Sandra asked. Renovate? Update? I shook my head. Not substantially. The cottage is perfect as it is. Simple, honest, connected to its history. I might refresh some paint, perhaps update the kitchen appliances eventually, but nothing that would alter its essential character. That evening, I sat on the dock watching another sunset, the 5th since I'd arrived at the cottage. The view was becoming familiar, comforting, the way the light turned golden as the sun descended, how the water changed from blue to amber to deep purple, the silhouettes of distant islands emerging against the glowing horizon. Frank had watched this same sunset countless times over the past 20 years. Had he felt the same peace I was beginning to find here? Had he sat on this dock, missing me, wishing he could share this beauty but unsure how to bridge the gap he'd created? I hoped he had. I hoped that in his final months, knowing he was setting in motion the events that would lead me here, he'd found some resolution, some ease in the knowledge that his divided self would finally be made whole through my discovery, as Gyam. The last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. I made my decision. I would keep the cottage. I would honor Frank's legacy by making this place part of my new life, not just a retreat or an investment property, but a home, at least for part of each year. And for the rest of the time? That path was still forming. But for the first time, since Frank's death, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Whatever shape it took, I would no longer be defined solely as a widow living in her son's basement, dependent and diminished. Frank's final secret, revealed at last, had given me more than just property. It had returned to me the possibility of reinvention, of beginning again. 1 year later, the morning light filtered through the curtains of my small apartment in Madison, Wisconsin. I sipped coffee at my kitchen table, reviewing my calendar for the coming week. My suitcase stood by the door, packed and ready for my drive to Harbor Springs the following day. It had been exactly 1 year since the letter arrived. 1 year since I'd discovered Frank's secret cottage and begun the journey that transformed my life from dependent widow to something entirely new. My phone chimed with a text message from Claire. Arrived in Chicago last night. Bradley picked me up at 10. Should reach Harbor Springs by 4. Can't wait to see the cottage and you. I smiled, heart warming at the thought of having both my children with me for Memorial Day weekend. Claire had finally seen the cottage 2 months ago during a brief visit, but this would be her first extended stay. Bradley had visited several times throughout the year, sometimes with Melissa, sometimes alone. My relationship with my daughter-in-law had shifted subtly since I'd moved out of their basement. The tension that had hummed beneath our every interaction had dissipated, replaced by a more genuine, if still somewhat formal, connection. Without the pressure of constant proximity, without her role as reluctant hostess and mine as unwanted guest, we'd found a new equilibrium. Not close, perhaps, but respectful, even occasionally warm. I finished my coffee and made a final check of the apartment. Everything was in order for my 3-month absence. The Madison apartment had been a fortunate find, a 1-bedroom unit in a quiet complex with reasonable rent, close enough to both Milwaukee and Chicago that I could visit friends and family easily. I'd signed the lease 8 months ago after my first summer renting out the cottage. Janet Kozlowski's prediction had proven accurate. The Harbor Springs cottage had rented quickly and profitably during the peak summer season, providing income, That, combined with my teacher's pension, allowed me to maintain two modest residences, the apartment in Madison and the cottage in Michigan. My life had fallen into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated but had come to cherish. Summers in Madison, close enough to Bradley and Claire for regular visits. Spring and fall at the cottage, enjoying the quieter seasons by the lake. Even a few winter weeks there, experiencing the hushed beauty of snow-covered pines and frozen shoreline. The cottage itself had changed little. I'd repainted some rooms, updated a few appliances, but preserved its essential character. The photographs of Samuel and Eliza Weiss still adorned the mantelpiece. Frank's journals remained in the desk drawer. The Adirondack chairs still faced the water from the same spots on the dock. But I had changed. The woman who had lived tentatively in her son's basement, diminished by loss and financial insecurity, had been replaced by someone more resilient, more independent. Someone who had confronted the past and fashioned from it a future she hadn't imagined possible. I locked the apartment door behind me and took one last walk around the neighborhood before my departure. Madison had proven to be the right choice, a vibrant small city with enough activities to keep me engaged, but not overwhelmed. I'd joined a book club at the local library, volunteered tutoring elementary students twice a week, and made a few casual friends among my neighbors. The life I'd built wasn't extraordinary, but it was mine. Not defined by Frank's absence or by dependency on my children, but created deliberately, thoughtfully from the unexpected opportunity his final secret had provided. The drive to Harbor Springs the next day felt like going home, though whether I was heading toward home or away from it had become pleasantly ambiguous. Both places belonged to me now, the apartment and the cottage, the city and the lakeshore, the present I was building and the past I had come to terms with. Arriving at the cottage by early afternoon, I had time to prepare for Claire and Bradley's arrival. I changed the bed linens in both bedrooms, arranged fresh flowers on the kitchen table, and stocked the refrigerator with their favorite foods. Small acts of mothering that now felt like choices rather than obligations. When their car pulled into the driveway, I was waiting on the porch, the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders. Claire emerged first, her California tan contrasting with the pale Michigan spring, face lighting up at the sight of me. Bradley followed, carrying their bags, his smile easy and relaxed in a way it hadn't been during my basement days. "Mom," Claire said, enfolding me in a tight hug that smelled of her familiar perfume. "You look wonderful." "The cottage is beautiful," she added, stepping back to take in the cedar siding, the green trim freshly painted last fall, the riot of spring wildflowers I'd encouraged to grow around the clearing. "Wait until you see the inside," Bradley told her, setting down the bags to give me a quick hug. "And the view from the dock, it's incredible at sunset." The three of us moved inside, Claire exclaiming over the cozy living room with its stone fireplace, the simple kitchen, the porch facing the water. Bradley carried their bags to the bedrooms while I made tea, the familiar domestic rhythm comforting after months of solitude. "So this is where Dad came all those years," Claire mused, studying the photographs on the mantelpiece. "His secret." "Get away!" "Not secret anymore," I said, setting the tea tray on the coffee table. "Now it's ours, a family place again, like it was for the Weiss family all those decades ago." Later, after dinner, we took our wine glasses to the dock and watched the sunset together. Frank's children and I, united in this place that had once been his solitary retreat. The conversation flowed easily, touching on Claire's work in California, Bradley and Melissa's tentative discussions about starting a family, and my volunteer activities in Madison. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the lake, Claire asked the question I'd been anticipating. "Are you happy, Mom, with this new life you've built?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give an honest answer. "Yes," I said finally. "Not in the way I was happy with your father. That was a different life, a different kind of contentment. But I'm at peace. I've found my footing again." Bradley nodded, understanding in his eyes. You seem more like yourself than you have since Dad died. More present. That's a good way to put it, I agreed. For a while there, I felt like I was fading, becoming invisible. The widow in the basement, trying not to take up too much. Space. Now I feel solid again, real. We stayed on the dock until the chill drove us inside, where Bradley built a fire in the fireplace and Claire made hot chocolate, a tradition from their childhood. Sitting there with my children, watching the flames dance and hearing their laughter, I felt a fullness that had nothing to do with the cottage's financial value or the independence it had helped me reclaim. This, I realized, was what Frank had truly given me, not just property or security, but a path back to myself, a way to reconnect with our children as equals rather than as a burden, a chance to transform loss into renewal. The weekend passed quickly, filled with hikes along the lakeshore, meals at Harbor Springs restaurants, conversations that stretched late into the night. Bradley and Claire absorbed the history of the cottage, of Samuel and Eliza Weiss, of the complicated man their father had been, formed by early loss, shaped by dual identities he never fully reconciled. On their final evening, we gathered on the porch as a gentle rain pattered on the roof. Claire had found Frank's journals earlier that day and had been reading them, her expression thoughtful as she closed the leather cover. I wish he'd told us, she said, echoing Bradley's words from a year ago. About Samuel, about this place, about who he really was. He told us in his own way, I replied softly. Through the values he lived by, through the love he showed us, through this final gift he arranged for us to discover together. Bradley reached over and took the journal from Claire, running his fingers across the embossed name, Franklin Weiss, that his father had set aside but never forgotten. You know what's strange? He said. I feel closer to Dad now, knowing about this part of him, than I did when he was alive. It's like seeing the complete picture for the first time. Claire nodded, wiping away a tear. It's like he's more real somehow. Not just Dad, but a whole person with complexities and contradictions, just like the rest of us. That's the gift of this place, I said, looking out at the rain-misted lake beyond the porch. It completed the picture of your father, made him fully dimensional, and in doing so, it gave us each a chance to become more complete versions of ourselves too. The next morning, I stood on the porch waving as Bradley and Claire drove away, promising to visit again soon. Claire in August when she'd be in Chicago for a conference. Bradley for the 4th of July weekend with Melissa. Alone again, I didn't feel the emptiness I'd expected. Instead, I felt a quiet contentment, a sense of rightness that had been absent during those basement months after Frank's death. I walked down to the dock and sat in one of the Adirondack chairs, watching a pair of loons glide across the water. The cottage behind me was no longer just Frank's secret retreat, or even simply my inheritance. It had become a gathering place, a connection point, a bridge between past and future. Frank had kept this place separate from our shared life for reasons I now understood. His divided self, Franklin Weiss and Frank Wilson, had needed this sanctuary to remain whole. But in revealing it to me after his death, he had created something new. Not division, but integration. Not secrecy, but legacy. From the basement to the lakeshore, from dependence to autonomy, from loss to renewal, my journey had come full circle. Not back to where I'd started, but to a new beginning. I couldn't have imagined when that letter first arrived, when a key to a safe deposit box opened not just a cottage door, but the door to the rest of my life. I closed my eyes, feeling the spring breeze against my face and the solid wood of the chair beneath me. In that moment, I was exactly where I needed to be. Not in someone else's basement, not in the shadow of what I'd lost, but fully present in a life that was, at last, entirely my own. Looking for more? we've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.